Good evening, I'm Christian Esguerra, and welcome to this episode of After the Fact, where we get to see things more clearly, where we get a better sense of the truth. Let's begin by dissecting the news. Presidential candidate Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has announced the initial lineup of senators who will be part of his ticket in the May elections. It's a mix of politicians belonging to some of the biggest political dynasties in the Philippines, former Duterte officials, and not to mention a Marcos loyalist. 3 of the 10 names were also included in the lineup of other presidential candidates. But while Bongbong's candidates will probably enjoy some of his perceived popularity, the affiliation may also be a double-edged sword because it would mean these senatorial candidates also having to defend their standard bearer, the son of the late dictator whose family amassed billions of dollars in ill-gotten wealth throughout the campaign. So the question is, will it be worth it? Now, be part of our discussion. Send us your questions and comments on our YouTube live chat or tweet us using the hashtag #ANCAfterTheFact. Joining us tonight is Professor Aris Arugay. He teaches political science at the University of the Philippines. Good evening, Professor Arugay, and thank you for joining us again on the program.
Thank you very much, Christian, and good evening.
Okay, so the tandem of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte has finally unveiled their initial lineup of senators in the 2022 elections. What do you think of the mix of the names that were mentioned? Basically, there are 10, and there are still 2 slots remaining.
Right. Well, we can see that it's a highly diverse and plural group, and I think there are very little or very narrow ties that bind all the current 10 senatorial candidates. We can actually group them. You mentioned the certain groupings, but what we wanted to appreciate is that it's a mixed bag of veterans, meaning re-electionists, those who have served senator terms before, but there are also those who seem to have been maybe selected because of their loyalty to the administration and perhaps by extension to Marcos Jr. and Mayor Sara Duterte. And finally, there are those that seem to belong to multiple lineups of senatorial candidates from different presidential candidates. So classic politics is addition logic that drives most of these shared senatorial candidates, not only from the ticket of Marcos Jr. and Duterte, but as well as other tickets for the presidency and vice presidency.
Okay. In coming up with this initial lineup of senators, did you see any significant compromise that had to be done, or basically it was an easy assembly of political figures simply because Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte were a natural draw because of their numbers, their political resources, basically?
Right. Well, that is true. I think if you're a senatorial candidate and you've been anointed or being chosen, luckily chosen to be part of the lineup, then that would somehow in your political calculation that would boost your chances of victory. But I also do think that it's a two-way street. Let's remember that senators are elected nationally. They have a national level constituency and they have to do some national level campaigning as well. So I do think that given that it's a two-way street, some senatorial candidates might also have benefits to the Bongbong Marcos Sara Duterte tandem, and perhaps they were chosen because they could fill up some of the gaps in their mapping of their political strengths, the zones that they will likely control come May 2022.
Like what? Because you have the likes of Sherwin Gatchalian, Hariroque, Jingo Estrada, Gibo Teodoro, Mark Villar. We know the resources that the family has and the vast political influence that they also enjoy or wield. I mean, can you cite specific contributions that some of these candidates could give to the tandem of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte?
Well, we know that, for example, I think of all the 10-member so far, the 10 of the senatorial candidates of their ticket, it's current Senator Zubiri that is mostly shared. In fact, he's shared by three other presidential candidates, Senator Lacson, Senator Pacquiao, and even VP Lenis. And then we saw the justification also for choosing him because he could draw in some of the votes from Mindanao that might I think it's really more the western part, given that Sara Duterte will likely bring the eastern flank of the vote. So that's one example. And I do think that, of course, the choice, particularly those of the candidates that are non-exclusive to the Marcos Jr. and Duterte tandem, we see that they're really faring well in the polls. And therefore, you know, being part of the team will likely mean that there's some political muscle, some political energy that these leading senatorial candidates can bring to their national campaign.
How about the case of former Duterte spokesman Hariroque? What does he bring to the table, to the tandem of Sara Duterte and of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte? He's not that high in the surveys.
That is true. We know that former presidential spokesperson Roque has been unconditionally loyal to the Duterte administration and by extension to Sara Duterte. I think what he could bring is to he might be able to bridge the what could be perceived differences or gaps between Duterte supporters as well as Marcos Jr. supporters. But of course, no one could do that better than Mayor Sara Duterte. But I do think he could act as a backup in terms of further forging the possible this alliance between the Marcoses and the Dutertes.
And how do you think this inclusion in the lineup of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte reflect on Hariroque, who we know is a former human rights lawyer who joined Duterte after initially attacking him, and then eventually he ended up defending him, perhaps just as furiously. And now he's joining the senatorial lineup of Bongbong Marcos, the son of the late dictator, under whose watch there were thousands of human rights violations, documented human rights violations.
Well, I do think that former spokesperson Roque is just being consistent, and this joining the tandem of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte is in line with his support not only of the Duterte administration but also its policies, and by extension, I do think that it would really be further confusing if he would not support a Marcos Jr. Sara Duterte tandem, because that may mean that there's too much flipping already going around.
Does this also somehow complete the swing to the other end of the pendulum, meaning from human rights defender to basically defending Rodrigo Duterte and now Bongbong Marcos?
Well, we know that politicians change colors all the time, and if politics is just all about particularly Philippine politics is just about politicians being highly consistent, it would be rare to find those kinds of politicians in our country. So as I've said, this is hardly surprising, but I do think that Hariroque's positioning will further alienate him from a certain segment of the population, those who won't likely vote for Marcos Jr. and Mayor Sara Duterte.
Okay. We know that when you are a presidential candidate and you're trying to put together a senatorial lineup, there is this expectation that you have a clear agenda in mind and you want that legislative agenda achieved during your presidency. That's why you're trying to assemble like-minded people. Now, this assembly, this aggregation of 10 names, 10 politicians, 10 political figures, do you see that that idea that I just laid out as a major binding force between Bongbong Marcos and these 10 names?
That
And
would be
before we can answer that, do you actually see a clear agenda, a campaign agenda, very detailed, coming from Bongbong Marcos to be able to answer that question?
well, that would be ideal, Christian, that senatorial candidates would somehow support the legislative agenda of their presidential candidate. In other words, because we know that they will belong, if they win their seats, they will go to the legislative branch, which is very critical. I mean, the president can only do so much in terms of policy making. Major policies need to be legislated. They need to become legislative statutes. And this is where the senators come in. Also, there are other important roles that senators play. However, as we have seen from the Marcos campaign, as we have not seen from the Marcos campaign, it would be very difficult to pinpoint the binding national legislative agenda so far as we have seen. Perhaps we will see it in the coming weeks as we enter the official campaign period. But so far, if we're going to look at the track records of these 10 candidates, as I've said, it's a mixed bag. I don't think that all of them share, for example, or will share the policy agenda of the campaign of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte. And therefore, I do think that in the end, it is pragmatism and addition that binds them more than shared principles and a shared legislative agenda.
Okay, in the first place, do senatorial lineups or tickets really matter in reality in presidential elections or national elections? Because looking at some of the names here, similar to other names that have been floated in other tickets of other presidential candidates, technically, some of these candidates can win on their own.
Exactly.
Especially given our very weak political party system, more so senatorial tickets. I mean, does it even matter?
Well, that's really the question. In fact, at the end, you might want to think that these senatorial candidates would be driven by the logic that, well, it won't harm to latch in their political calculation to latch on to a Senate and to a presidential and vice presidential ticket that might draw in some votes. But I think this logic is also dictated by the fact that we are seeing a very tight senatorial race. There are too many contenders. There are too many electable or winnable senatorial candidates. And it might matter that especially the last few places, number 10 to number 12, it could just be a matter of a couple of thousand votes, a couple of hundred even. And at the end, they would want any chance to get ahead, to be in that, we call it the magic 12. And in their calculation, if that means being a guest candidate of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, even if they don't really share anything in common in terms of agenda, then their campaigns might say that there's no harm. We can latch on to their campaigns.
But I suppose that particular last place battle, assuming let's say the last two or last three slots, would be operational if you talk about the endorsed votes on the ground, right? If you talk about sample ballots as agreed upon with certain political clans or local leaders. But strictly speaking, since this is a nationwide campaign, how big a factor is that?
Well, yes, we know that the presidency, the vice presidency, and senators are elected nationally. But I do think some of the senatorial candidates are also trying to have a feel of what is the sentiments on the ground locally. And if they see that Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte will be able to drum up a lot of local level support, then that would further justify their choice of accepting or at least being part of this tandem. So in other words, while it could be that they're both doing national campaigns, and as what you've said, local politics matters, but we also know that local politicians, they also could shift loyalties. And sometimes they also try to be on the winning side. And perhaps in their calculation, given the poll so far, it seems that logically, it's better to bet on the leading candidate now. And however, that might likely change if there are new polls that would reveal that the numbers would be different.
Can these candidates also benefit in a way from the popularity, or at least the perceived popularity of their standard bearer?
Oh, definitely. I mean, but although, of course, if you see at the lineup, some senators are veterans as well. They've done presidential or even vice presidential campaigns before, and it doesn't hurt, I think, that for example, if we're going to be allowed to do some limited face-to-face campaigning, that if they could be able to draw in crowds in sorties, that the senatorial candidates can piggyback and benefit from the ability of these of the presidential and vice presidential candidate to be able to muster crowds and perhaps with the hope of them being translated into votes.
But how far can that transference go? For instance, the likes of Larry Gadon, he lost in previous elections. I think at least 2, if I'm not mistaken. But to be sure, he ran in the previous election and he lost. I mean, can you honestly believe that the popularity of his standard bearer, he is a known loyalist of the Marcoses, assuming that, let's say, Bongbong Marcos indeed is hitting 50% and above? I mean, can that actually benefit and help him win a seat in the Senate?
I think for Attorney Gadon, as well as others that seem to be more faithful or loyal on the Marcos Jr. side more than on the Duterte side, I do think that these are candidates of the base, and somehow, in a way, perhaps the choice could be because it's some form of reward or for being able to be loyal, and therefore some of the hardcore supporters of Marcos Jr. Will like that choice because Attorney Gadon has been in the mainstream media quite a lot, both famously and infamously, and therefore the base will likely react positively with this inclusion in the tandem. On whether that is enough, that is sufficient for him to win a seat, that remains to be seen.
Okay, let's talk about the risks as far as these candidates are concerned, because even if Bongbong Marcos is very popular, he also has a lot of detractors. He also has a lot of critics, those who refuse to move on, and rightly so, from the evils of martial law, of his father's dictatorship, and the ill-gotten wealth that the family amassed. If you're running under a particular standard bearer, a presidential candidate, naturally you would be expected to defend that candidate's policies, that candidate's position. You have no other choice, especially if your candidate has refused to speak to regular journalists unless they are actually very much favorable to you. So what are the risks? Let's say for the likes of Sherwin Gatchalian, Lauren Legarda, Mig Zubiri, for instance.
Right. Definitely. I do think that there are sizable risks of being affiliated with the Marcos Jr. and Duterte lineup. I think we can expect that some voters will be will not like and will likely drop some of these candidates by virtue of their affiliation. But at the end, as I've said, this is all addition and calculation. So perhaps for some of these candidates, particularly the guest candidates, those that have not seemed to be connected or affiliated with Marcos Jr. Before in previous electoral cycles, perhaps in their calculation, the risk is manageable because, and for now, the costs do not outweigh the possible benefits. So some of them have accepted to be part of the lineup or have they wanted to be part of the lineup. But at the end, we'll have to see whether their gamble is paying off. The risks of being affiliated with the Marcoses will alienate some voters. But I do think for some of these candidates, the alienation, the percentage of the voting public that will be alienated might not be as much or as many as those that they could gather in terms of votes if they belong to the ticket.
Again, it's a matter of benefit, risk, weighing the risk with the expected benefit, no?
Right.
Risk benefit analysis on their part. But for instance, the likes of former Public Works Secretary Mark Villar, again, they have the resources. He's faring quite well in recent surveys. Can candidates like him under the lineup of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte afford not to answer questions about their standard bearer? For instance, can they do a Bongbong Marcos and basically shy away from those questions?
Well, you know, Filipino politicians, I think, have mastered the art of evading the questions, and this is why it's incumbent on the media, on even the voting public, especially those of us who knows politics a little more, to be able to continue pushing and asking the tough questions. But you know, I do think for some of these candidates, the moment they decided to belong to this ticket, they've already rehearsed and practiced their responses to those questions. So they will likely try to evade spin, hire spin doctors to be able to help them to reframe and to make sure that their narrative will not be able to be tainted by whatever it is that is negative, negative by association with Marcos Jr.
I remember in the previous election that I covered, the same was a situation of certain candidates running for senator, and there were questions raised against his specific standard bearer. And I think one answer that I got from one particular senatorial candidate was, "I'm not the one running for president, so I'm running for senator." But to me, that was an excuse. So siguro, this is also a pattern or a route that they can take. No,
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah. Christian, it's really because we have not developed the habit of really placing candidates into mutually exclusive lines, political lines, and this has something to do with our weak party system. So therefore, our Filipino politicians have so much leeway, so much flexibility, and I sometimes describe it as contortionists. They can twist, they can bend over backwards, bend over forwards, sidewards, diagonally, and all these stuff, simply because there are no parties that pin them down and say that this is not, you should not be associated with this candidate. This is not how our party works, and because politicians as personalities have outlived parties and they basically have made parties obsolete. This is why they have so much power to reframe themselves, to reimagine themselves, and to repackage themselves, so that any kind of questions trying to pin them down, they will likely survive and even thrive because of that.
Now, given the personality-centered politics that we have, that's very, very true. Sinasabi nyo na political parties don't really matter. They exist in the Philippines, but technically they don't matter. Now, if you're a voter, does the Filipino voter generally really care about a senatorial candidate's affiliation as far as ticket is concerned? For instance, kunwari, yung mga pangalan na binanggit natin dito kanina, they have their own strong support base already. We know that for a fact because of their previous victories in previous elections. For instance, the likes of Loren Legarda. So yung mga ganyan, let's say supporters of Loren Legarda, do they actually, you think, care whether she's associated with the Marcos, with the Robredo, with Ping Lacson or Manny Pacquiao?
We'll have to ask Senator Legarda that question, but I think at the end, some of these politicians think that they're beyond parties, that they're beyond any part of partisan identity that they have been affiliated before, and they could easily just say that, well, my track record is the one who should speak and not just my current political affiliation. So unfortunately, we have not given politicians enough of a hard time in making sure that they've been accountable to the political choices that they're making. But fortunately, Christian, we have this May 2022 elections to do that. So I do think that voters need to be a little bit stricter. If candidates are imposing discipline by virtue of mandatory military service, then perhaps voters should turn the tables around. They should make sure that politicians get disciplined by virtue of their choices in terms of political affiliation.
Okay, finally, pag-usapan natin na Professor Aruga yung concept and reality of balimbing politics in the Philippines. You mentioned track record for voters to actually look into the track record of candidates. When you talk about political butterflies o yung pagpalipat-lipat nila ng partido, technically there are politicians who could argue na I never switched parties or I didn't really move to another party. But I supported whoever was in Malacanang. Okay, I kept the party, pero patalantalan siya in terms of affiliation. No? That can also be a justifiable argument or reason. Pero my question is, based on your observation in previous election cycles, does loyalty actually matter for the Filipino voter? Let's say, do they really try to hold accountable politicians who've been jumping from one president to another, not because of simple support as a member of that chamber, but simply because of expediency? Kasi may pakinabang sila, not for their constituents, but for themselves politically or perhaps even personally.
Right. Unfortunately, Christian, I'm not saying all, but a lot of Filipino voters think that this is political skill, political savvy. Right? Political prowess. If a politician is able to change colors, is able to do a 180-degree turn multiple times, for them, that's an indicative characteristic of a politician that's able to survive. But at the end, yung sinabi mo na, well, ang sinusuportahan ko lang naman yung nasa Malacanang, babalik tayo sa totoong esensya sa isang demokrasya. Ang loyalty po ng mga botante, ng mga citizens, hindi po sa politiko, sa bayan, at ganun din po yung mga politiko. No? So I do think voters need to think that they're the ones that have power in May 2022 and that politicians are the ones trying to court them in being able to borrow some of that power. So if voters are empowered, they would have the ability to reimagine elections as a form of accountability. Because if we'll not start now, when will we start? We need to think about finally making these politicians as humans and humans that could be voted out of office, could be made accountable, just like the rest of us.
Okay. Professor Aris Arugay, thank you very much for joining us tonight on the program.
Thank you, Christian. Have a good evening.
And stay safe.
Ingat.
We're going to take a quick break. After the fact, we'll be right back.